All right, hey everyone. Welcome to this lesson on clothing in motion. And what I want to do in this lesson, I primarily want to do a little bit more of an analytical approach. And then in the next lesson, we'll put that into practice. And what I want to discuss is how you can think about clothing in motion a little bit. Again, this is not set in stone. It's just something that I like to use when I'm thinking about clothing in motion and how you can do the same or use some of these principles. And what I tend to see here, I have some examples here, and I'll later in the assignment tell you how you can go about using reference. But what we have here is a couple of pictures, a couple of still frames from videos that I actually captured, which I think is better to look at instead of just still life pictures. I'm sure there are a lot of good pictures out there that you can use, but I like to use video because, again, it's motion, right? It's literally a motion picture, which is easier to understand why these things move and how they move and how you can get reference and inspiration out of that. Because a lot of the times when I need to do a dynamic scene, I will probably use more of video reference, shoot it myself or look at it online instead of going for still frames, still pictures. All right, so with that said, what I want to talk about in this first example, as you can see here, is the ballet dancer on the left, very graceful. And what I tend to notice when it comes to clothing in motion is, first of all, it of course depends on the length and the looseness of the cloth, right? I don't know if that's a term, but the looser your clothing or drapery is, the more it can actually move, right? It makes sense if you have very skin tight, like the jeans that you see on Tom in the upper right, it will have some wiggle room, but it won't have a lot, right? It's more rigid, so it won't fall under some of the principles that I'll be talking about. But what I have, let's say, observed when it came to clothing in motion is that most of them follow three principles. And I'm not sure if this is correct. This is just my observation. Keep that in mind. But I do think it can be useful. So when we look at the ballet dancer, one of the most obvious principles that we can see is twisting, right? So this will happen a lot when we're moving, right? When we're doing something, when we're running, when we're jumping, when we're doing a pirouette like this, we'll twist our bodies, right? So our axes will change, and that will create a twist in the body. Whether it's any part of the body or the entire body, there will be a twist happening. Now, when this twist happens, we create a new point of tension, right? So instead of keeping to the original points of tension, because that twist, it kind of overpowers the initial or the original point of tension, and it creates this new point of tension. And most of the time, this will create spiral folds. So as you can see here on the picture, let me indicate that in red. See if that's yeah. All right. So you will see that we have this clear point of tension here from her hip because she's twisting, right? Because she's twisting our body. So she is twisting her body, let's say, this way, right? So she's rotating a certain way. And that makes it that the body it needs to follow, but the clothing cannot catch up yet. And we'll talk about that principle later. But because of that, it creates that point of tension around her hip. And you can clearly see that in the drapery that we have these beautiful spiral folds kind of, like fanning out from there. Right. And because this is a looser cloth, this is a skirt, again, those spiral folds end up in pipe folds, right? Because they end up in something that gets compressed at the top and it kind of fans out at the bottom. And so we get this beautiful array of pipe folds in that skirt. And so where the twisting isn't that hard yet or that forceful yet, we will still just keep the original, let's say, pipe folds that we have from a skirt naturally. But so that's what we tend to see when it comes to clothing in motion, is that we'll have these, you know, these new points of tension that are being created. And you can obviously see this as well in the bottom right image of Tom Cruise running, right? So we can see his jacket. He's like really forcefully moving his arms, and because of that, again, it's a twisting motion and a compressing motion, right? Because he's compressing those two pieces of fabric together. But that again creates a point of tension, and you can obviously see again that we have this spiral fold being created that is fanning out across his body. Now this will move across his jacket, and it won't result into literal pipe folds at the end, because again, it's not as loose. This clothing isn't as loose. It's a jacket, right? It's tight fitting. It's probably some type of leather or denim jacket, so it fits pretty tightly around his body. So it's still going to keep its structure primarily, so it's not going to end up being these pipe folds, but it is going to wrap around his body. So because of that twist and because of that compression, we are creating these spiral folds that end up wrapping around his body, and then some of them probably end up into half locks because they compress, because of course the fabric needs to kind of change its state in order to, because the fabric, it doesn't become or there's not more fabric or less fabric, it's just the same amount of fabric. So when you compress it upwards, it needs to, let's say, compensate somewhere else, and so it will compress around the body on the other side of the torso, and that will compress, and some of those pipe folds that are compressing will overlap each other and create this half lock. Now, one of the other things that we need to keep in mind, and that you should keep in mind when you're analyzing these reference pictures, is that there's also a certain rule of animation applying to a lot of these things when it comes to clothing in motion. And that is two principles called drag and follow through. Now, these things will be used a lot in animation, like all the time. And because it gives a more natural feeling to how the body moves, how clothing moves, how anything that's an additional feature or moving part on the main body will experience this kind of drag and follow through, usually in animation. And so for clothing, it's the exact same thing. And so what I mean by that, if we look at the ballerina girl again, it's the same thing, right? So what tends to happen is that because she is twisting her body abruptly, now let me get rid of these lines, because she's twisting her body abruptly one way, right? The clothing drags behind it. It literally lags behind, right? Because it needs to catch up. And that's what they call drag, right? Because the main body of motion is faster than the secondary features that need to follow that motion, right? And this creates that natural feeling of motion in clothing. And so when she's twisting her body this way, right? Because she's in motion, right? Her hips probably used to be here, right? And her legs, and now she was rotating them really fast to the other way. And so the clothing cannot keep up with that, so it drags behind, right? So this is where all of this kind of drags behind, and that's why it also creates that spiral fold, right? Because it comes from one point of tension and it goes towards the place where it literally drags behind. So it's like it's almost happening in, or a couple frames behind. I don't know how to explain it any better. There's a lot of good videos on this on YouTube. If you want to talk about principles of animation, it's one of the main principles of animation. It's overlapping action and follow through. This is the one that you should look up. There's some really good videos on there. And so the same exact thing is happening on the other side, where this part of her hip, right, the back part of her hip was probably originating here, and it's now twisting to that side, right? Because those hips are rotating, and so this part of the clothing is dragging behind from the other side, right? So again, that's why we have this beautiful fan of that skirt because it's lagging, like literally dragging or lagging behind on both sides. And this is what also creates that motion in clothing. Now, if you look at Tom Cruise here in the top right, if we look at his pants, because he's falling, it should follow those rules of dragging as well. However, because they're so skin tight and very rigid, it doesn't have a lot of it. Like some of it you might see, like let's say here in the piping, but other than that, because it's so skin tight, not a lot of it will be, let's see, it's subject to that dragging behind. If you look at the jacket, however, it's a lot looser, and you can literally see that here, right? So Tom is already, his main body, right? Because there's always a main body, is already falling much faster, and because of gravity and air catching underneath that, the jacket is literally dragging behind. And so this creates that, that drag that you see in clothing, and it also creates that nice sense of clothing in motion. Because if you want to convey a body in motion, you need to keep these principles in mind. Because if we were to draw Tom with the jacket almost being skin tight, same as the jeans, we wouldn't really believe that he's falling, right? And that's the thing. That's how you create believability in your designs. So that's what drag is all about. Now, follow through is a lot harder to find references of, because follow through happens when the main body animation is done and the secondary pieces that are animated follow through with the action. So because they come later, they do the exact same thing, but they follow through and then they restore to the original point. Now, what this means is if, let's say, Tom were to land his jump, right, which in this case he didn't, by the way, behind the scenes, but if he were to land his jump, right, I'm just going to draw his main body from the side. Right, he would probably just, land like this. Right. But the jacket, we're not gonna, let's say, just draw the jacket like this. What the jacket is going to do is going to follow through with the action. So it's going to literally, and let me pull up another color, it's going to literally propel forward, right? Maybe not as extreme, but it's going to propel forward before it restores to its original position where the main body is. And that's what they call follow through. And you can see this a lot, like if you see like a superhero landing with a cape, it's the same thing. The body comes to an abrupt standstill, but the clothing itself still needs to follow through with the action. And that's what they call follow through. So that's something that you should definitely can pay attention to. It's not as common, but actually when you have a body in motion, constantly, repetitively in motion, like with the ballerina here, it's actually a constant mixture between follow through and drag, because what will happen is this piece of clothing that I actually just showed you that was dragging behind, it's also following through because it's doing a follow through movement from a previous movement, right? I hope that makes sense. But so because her hips were in another position, that clothing, that skirt was following through because she probably, let's say she was twisting repetitively. Her hips kind of, let's say in a still frame, ended here. Right? And so let's say she was coming from a previous position that was more of a side view like this, right? And see, so she was rotating this way. The clothing, her skirt would follow through because in a still frame, she would stop here. And so that clothing would follow through. Same for the skirt on the other side, and it would follow through, and it would be tighter here, right, like this. I'm just going to draw it as one hole. And so that follows through, but then she rotates again, right? So she rotates again this way, right, like we see her in the reference. And so that skirt still hanging on here cannot keep up with her motion. So it's still at its original point. So it needs to, right? It needs to drag behind. So first it was following through, and now it's dragging behind, which creates that drag that we're seeing in the body. Right, so I hope that kind of makes sense, what I'm trying to tell you. But these are like the 3 principles that I keep in mind when I'm thinking about clothing in motion. So most of the time, we will see a twist of the body happening, of the main body in motion, and then the clothing is either dragging behind or it's following through, depending on the motion itself, right? It's all dependent on the motion. So it's either following through or dragging behind. But most of the time, there's definitely a twist happening, especially when we talk about characters, right? And I mean, when we talk about drapery, it's usually related to characters that are wearing them. Now, even if you were to put a cape on a dog, same thing, right? The dog would still twist or bend. And so the cape would drag behind and it would get twisting motions. So there would be spiral folds happening there as well. But a lot of the times the twist will be the most obvious, right? As you can see here with Tom's jacket, if we were to draw it, right, we would literally have him pulling up his arm like very abruptly. And that creates a completely new point of tension that really creates those spiral folds that you can see. And then on the other side, we have the arm propelling forward, right, which also creates a point of tension on the elbow, right? So there's lots of points of tensioning happening here. And so the other side of the jacket, you can see that the loose ends of the jacket are still following through or dragging behind. It's one of the two, right? But because it's a perpetual motion, all of these principles are happening at the same time. And so that sleeve is coming towards us, and we basically still have, let's say, the regular principles of a spiral fold happening across the arm, right? Because it's twisting as well. Oh, sorry, Tom. Right, so you can really, really, really see that main point of tension that is happening on that jacket. And now because of the material of the jacket, the compression will depend, of course, right? Because if this were a satin jacket, let's say, you would see a lot more spiral folds and they would just end up in that point. But because it's such a rigid jacket, it's either denim or leather, I don't know, it kind of also starts to compress onto itself, and we get some of these zigzag folds just because of the nature of the fabric. And it's very hard to see in a lot of these, especially when you are looking for these still frames. Some of them will be unclear, but I actually think that's a good thing. That's a really good thing to practice and pay attention to, and kind of see for yourself if you understand the principles, instead of just relying on, you know, relying on the reference itself and just copying what you see. Trying to really understand what's going on, and see if you can, you know, draw it that way. All right. So I hope that kind of makes sense, what I'm trying to tell you. But it's just like, I just want to make sure that you understand how I think about these things. And at least what for me makes sense, right? It doesn't have to necessarily always make sense to you. I can only show you and teach you what I use to problem solve things. And I do like thinking about these three principles, just thinking about, you know, a body that's usually always twisting when clothing is in motion. And then that we always almost get the principles of animation, which is drag and follow through. And the most noticeable pipes or types of folds that are being created when we have clothing in motion is, again, the pipe fold, because because it's fanning out, and especially when we have loose clothing. A lot of spiral folds, because we're creating that point of tension to which those pipe folds are going, and because we have a twist, right? Because remember, spiral folds usually get made because there's a twist in the main body, and so they just follow, you know, the pipe folds. But a lot of times we can have half locks as well, because of these twisting and compression that's happening a lot of the times, like you see here in the shoulder part of the jacket of Tom. It's like, because he's like compressing it so much together, it kind of folds over onto itself and you create that half lock. Same thing happening here. For your assignment, what I want you to do now is I want you to gather at least 10 pieces of reference from any type of video still frame. So what you're going to do is you're going to pick a still frame, and I would recommend, you know, one of these things. You can do, let's say, dancing videos, dancing choreography. You can do what I like to look up a lot of the times is chase scenes. So like a foot chase scene. It's where I got these pictures from. There's some really great references in that. There's a lot of motion in that, you know, and you know they all have a costume on, so there's a lot of things that you can, or references that you can gather there. Or you could look up free running, which is always a good thing as well, and fight scenes, right? So some great fight scenes there in a lot of movies. Especially if you look at like Asian fight scenes that are maybe kung fu related or anything of the sort, because their costuming is usually a little bit more looser. But even modern day things like The Raid, for instance, they have very modern clothing, but a lot of them also, the stuntmans are also wearing loose clothing. So again, that's great reference for modern clothing in motion. But you can also, of course, look up fantasy movies, fight scenes like Lord of the Rings, a lot of that. But, you know, especially if you have Gandalf on his horse, beautiful reference for clothing in motion, right? So these are things you should really consider, and also just consider like, what principles am I discovering in each of these still frames? So again, to recap, 10 different pieces of reference from still frames that you gather from video material. And based on that, you are going to just analyze. You can draw it if you want, but you're primarily going to analyze. Well, you need to draw it, but when you draw it out, what we just need to see is a breakdown of what the principles that you're seeing. So where is the twist happening? Where do we see compression? Where do we see follow through or drag? All right. So that's it. Have fun with this assignment, guys. Pay attention to it. Take your time with this one. And then I'll see you in the next video.